Welcome to episode 45 of the Filmumentaries Podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you from my house here in London. If you're a new listener, after listening to this one, go back to the beginning and work your way through all 44 episodes that precede this one. There's some 50 hours of movie conversation for you to enjoy. If you're a regular listener, thanks for joining me again, and of course for your support. On the subject of support, there are now 87 of you helping me produce this podcast via Patreon, patreon.com/Jamie Benning. Amazing. I still can't believe it. Every time I get a new patron, I'm just amazed. Also, particular thanks to one recent patron who has donated so much, it's basically covered the cost of web hosting for the year for me. Amazing. Thank you so much. So for this episode, number 45, February 2022, I have another film legend in the shape of Garrett Brown. If that's not a name you recognise, you'll know his work, trust me. Garrett invented the steadicam. He's operated it on over 100 films, most notably for me, films that I love, Rocky, The Shining, and Return of the Jedi. 3 really different films and 3 completely different applications of the steadicam. The steadicam, of course, is a camera stabilising system. It's got the stability of a conventional tripod mount, but with the fluid motion of a dolly shot, as well as giving you that kind of flexibility of handheld camera work. Garrett's incredible invention smoothly follows the operator's movements, while the steadicam arm absorbs jerks and bumps and shakes. And it has this kind of almost frictionless gimbal, which gives precise control of the camera and framing. I think, we're now used to having gimbals and things like the Ronin and DJI Osmo, but the fact that you've still got full control of the framing as well with the Steadicam is the reason it's never been bettered, ultimately. It's used on everything from feature films, light entertainment TV shows, and just about every sport you can think of. I know a few Steadicam ops myself. Garrett also won a Special Academy Award for Science and Technology. Just to put this into perspective, previous winners include those responsible for colour film, and since then, Avid, IMAX, all those kind of seismic innovations within the industry. And Garrett, is one of those people responsible. There are very few productions of a certain size that you won't see a Steadicam on. I just wanted to give a huge thanks to my friend and an old colleague of mine, Patrick Van Weeren, for putting me in touch with Garrett a few years ago now, and providing me also with some research literature that I wouldn't have otherwise found. Patrick now is no longer in Europe. He's down in Australia working down there. Very good cameraman, very nice guy, and a lover of movies like me, and hopefully all of you. Oh, by the way, if you're a patron of $3 or more, then there's a video version of this podcast waiting for you over on patreon.com. So here's my conversation with Garrett Brown, Steadicam inventor, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Garrett, I understand that your father was an inventor. Did it feel like you were always destined to have that eureka moment? And was there any pressure on you from yourself or anybody else to come to that moment?
Yeah, my dad actually invented something very valuable not to himself, but to the DuPont company, who made a fortune from it. But he had signed an agreement at a young age, giving them, of course, all rights as a budding new chemist. And he invented the binding material that still is used on all paperbacks and magazines and so on, because it can be bound rapidly and doesn't ever break and crack like the old animal glue used to do. I confess to being more impressed with his zeal for the idea of inventing than, because I was a kid, I didn't know much about the invention itself. He actually set me up for a vast humiliation at one point on the subject of inventing, because he handed off a sample of what we can now call Lexan, which DuPont had just invented. If you know what I don't know if you use that same brand name in the UK, but it's the super clear version of what we call lucite, a polycarbonate plastic. Mm-hmm. And he casually told me that it was unbreakable, and I was going to take it to show and tell. You can see where this is going, right? And I quizzed him a little. Is it truly unbreakable? And he was a little annoyed that I was interrogating about it. Yes, yes. Is that, you mean it couldn't possibly be broken? No, didn't want to discuss it. So I made that assertion in front of show and tell, and of course was immediately challenged by people. If you ran over it with a truck, would it break? No. If you blew it up with an A-bomb, would it break? No. I was holding my ground on, out of honor and loyalty. At recess, a kid simply laid it from a curb down to the street and stomped on it, and it broke. And I was baffled and humiliated. And of course, he crowed about it, never told everybody. So I had an abstract appreciation of invention. My dad, gave me his copy of The Boy's Life of Edison and brochures about Steinmetz, Charles Steinmetz, the great, and other luminaries at GE. But at that era, newsreels made fun of inventors pretty cruelly. That was, if you can remember way back, we would see newsreels, even the tail end of them in theater. And one of their delights was to skewer people that came up with gizmos, usually foreign people who could try to defend their invention in an engaging foreign accent and then fail spectacularly because of flames, explosions, things falling apart, etc. And the comic books made fun of inventing. Donald Duck's uncle was called Gyro Gearloose, which gives you a sense of how much reverence they had for inventing. So I recoiled from the whole idea, and all I wanted to do was become an entertainer, a folk singer, which I did to my dad's disgust, because I had to give up a very valuable scholarship in order to quit and go and be in a folk group. And in fact, I couldn't just quit the scholarship. The only way I could leave it was a Navy scholarship. The only way I could leave without being an enlisted man for 4 years was to flunk everything. If I quit, I was an enlisted man. Right. Oddly enough, if I flunked everything, they just said, go, be gone. So I did one of the best jobs I ever did in college was comprehensively flunking everything. And I got out and did that for 3 years. Loved that job. Great job. But there must be some residual, at least, acknowledgement that inventing has its uses, because I've actually been thinking about it, and the Steadicam wasn't the first attempt at inventing. And I realized that my little film company, very far from Hollywood, lumbered with big, heavy gear because that's what I thought I had to have. I learned my trade reading books about filmmaking in the library. I owned an 800-pound dolly. I owned a bunch of really enormous studio lights, Mole Richardson and Bardwell and McAllister, giant, Fresnels, and big old lamp bulbs that had BBs in them that you had to swirl the BBs, as you may know, to get rid of the carbon now and that. This was an early era, one step removed from arc lights, in effect. And so in answer to local filmmaking problems, I invented a dog's eye view dolly for a commercial. It ended up winning a Clio. This is our Hutch Top award for commercials at the time, because it yielded a spectacular eye view of a beagle waddling home to his great little woman there. You're tired, Fred, your collar's too tight, you got a great little woman there, et cetera, and the dog's eye view leaned 45 degrees to pee on a hydrant that it had just passed, and that was regarded as hilarious and so on. And that was a single wheel with my Aeroflex out front and a counterweighted handle, a big soft balloon tire with the air out of it that just bobbled along, and was, oddly enough, stable as hell because of its length. And into my brain went all those, observations as I looked closely at the results of all these things. And then I had a World War II Rommel era Aeroflex still with its desert, desert paint, OD, desert paint under the black wrinkle. That if it got dinged, you could see the desert paint. It was one of those Rommel North African Aries,
Yeah.
But it was noisy. And it occurred to me that, that a vacuum might be the lightest way to stop its noise getting outside, looking at underwater housings as an example, you don't need much around a camera. In fact, you want the least amount of space around it so it isn't too damn buoyant if you're underwater housing. And you've got to feed a pass through to, control focus. There were some analogs to what I was thinking of. And I took my Arri to my old high school and my former physics teacher, and I put it under a bell jar and sucked the air out. And it was silent. I was sitting on a rubber mat in a bell jar, dead quiet. So I commissioned a hapless would-be machinist. First, we were going to cover it with fiberglass and, just wrap cloth around it and put fiberglass around it, and that would automatically leave a void, and then cut that in half and seal it and put the two halves together like Magdeburg spheres, if you know the reference, that two spheres where they suck the air out of things about this big and two horses couldn't pull them apart, that kind of thing. And so all it would need is a valve and a pass-through and a good solid optical flat in front of the lens and the halves coming apart. And so that when you needed to reload, you let the air out, back into it, pull it apart, load it, clap it together, tuck it, suck the air out, and you're dead quiet. And I calculated it would add about 5 pounds to the weight of an Arriflix. Jamie, this is an era when the blimp, which I declined to buy for the Arri, weighed 100 pounds and was quiet by virtue of lead foil and goat skin layers.
Wow.
So it did strike me that this could be of great value in the movie business. But that didn't amount to anything because along the path after I had given it out to be made in aluminum, which this fellow wanted to do instead of fiberglass. But to do that, he would have to hog out 2 enormously heavy blocks of aluminum, an awful lot of machining.
Right, yeah.
And I encountered Lee DeForest. Does that name ring any bells?
No.
Lee DeForest was one of the most famous inventors in the 1920s. He invented, let's see, what was it? An optical track recording, was it? I'm not sure. He invented the vacuum tube, among other things. That was his primary contribution. But he tossed off a minor invention and patented a camera and a bell jar to silence it. And so when I encountered that patent, I thought, oh, damn, I can't get anything, any primary coverage. And my friend failed abominably to machine the blimp and claimed that it had been stolen from his house and laid his stereo out in the backyard to try and convince me that the thieves had been discovered and dropped his stereo, but made off with the vacuum blimp. So the combination of those two things was like, I gave it up. And I joked that, I've never seen any sign that in a pawn shop somewhere would ever be the remains of this vacuum blimp looking like 2 odd ashtrays or whatever. So that did not cure me of the idea of inventing, but it was a little chastening. I'd spent a little money on it, And you know what? What I didn't realize was I could have had a really powerful patent on that, something I've learned since, because it included the idea of a filter to filter the air as it went back into the blimp, without which dust would be in every magazine immediately and it would be hopelessly useless. And Lee DeForest's version would have been useless the instant he let the air back in because of dust on the film, So that one claim would have made it a valuable patent, but I didn't know it at the time. And by the time I figured that out, there was the, Panaflex, which I admired, and the Arriflex BL.
I mean, those handheld cameras that came, they freed up the movement of the camera from being on a dolly, but it gave us a perspective that wasn't quite what it was trying to be, which was the point of view of a human being. But your invention went that step further to replicate something that's more natural to us in the way that we see that there's this fluidity to it. What was the problem that you saw in the industry that you then managed to overcome with the Steadicam, and how did you do that? How did you get into that zone to be able to come up with that idea?
Well, I know now a great deal more about the way we see and what the Steadicam actually accomplished than I did at the moments of trying to think it up and inventing it and prototyping it. And that was a long process. That was inspired by another invention, which was a camera that hung on a pole 30 feet below a helicopter, so that I could shoot ground level stuff that I was hoping would be reasonably stable, of the brand new Subarus or one of the early Subaru commercials, and then fly away, And that was the moment that I was inspired to do. And that thing turned out to be a spectacular object. It was a foam ball. Even if you got it too low, it would just skid on the ground without harm. And I was actually gauging the height of it by the pilot looking at the shadow of it. We shot it in an airport in Indio, California. And the shots are spectacular. And I had tested the idea with a couple of cameras on poles earlier and learned that they're astonishingly stable in tilt and roll, because those are the long axes of the pole. But in pan, the early ones were very unstable because there was no inertia there, right? So by the time I got to the Subaru commercial, I had a 5-foot bar with a couple of weights, T-bar at the top of the thing, which settled it down a little bit in pan. And those shots are insanely stable and really, really interesting. And of course, the aha moment when you fly away is amazing. So it was staring at the results of that sent me along looking for poles. But what was my goal? My goal was, I loved handheld. I hated the way it looked. I just wanted to be able to shoot stable handheld, without then reference to the way humans see, that came later on a form of analysis that's still going on. I'm still figuring that out. But the first ones that I made were, fairly primitive T-bars with weights that, and in each case I shot some astonishing stuff. The T-bar with weights tilt rises when you tilt up. That annoyed me, as I've said many times. So that led to a parallelogram version that had weights and that moved from, I wanted it to go floor to ceiling. That was part of the dream. Because I love what happens with the lens down low and up high, up overhead. And I wanted to go from one to the other. The Steadicam failed to deliver that initially because in order to get it to work in 35 millimeter, and I shot 16 stuff with that parallelogram that knocked their socks off in LA, but they all said, kid, you have to do it in 35 millimeter or it won't be useful. And I hadn't revealed how it was done. But also looking at my long-suffering operators with the parallelogram, which was hugely heavy and awkward and had a fiber optic viewfinder, fairly terrible, and so on. And I watched them stumbling across pastures with this thing, and I thought even if you could lift it, it wouldn't be worthy. And I went notoriously into a motel for a week to try and rethink the whole thing, and did, and came out with a plan that I was a little disappointed in, because it would really, the lens heights would really only go from the waist to over the head. And that is the primary weight, height range for a Steadicam with 2 arm lengths in any event. And then there, on Stanley Kubrick's behalf, later came low mode, flipping it upside down so that you go from the waist down to below the knees. But my goal was to let you be as agile as you are in life, on your feet, which is the ultimate dolly, in the same way that a horse is the ultimate off-road vehicle,
It's great watching you. Sorry, I was going to say it's great watching you on that demo reel, just absolutely legging it, running as fast as you can with the rig on. It must have been pretty exhilarating to realize the shots that you were getting.
But we thought that it was a stunt device initially.
Right.
Because certainly that would be useful enough to be able to run and do stuff. And that stuff looked, surprisingly good. The plan that I came out of the motel room with was it. All Steadicams still are made that way. There are 4 elements to the original patent, which was never busted, incidentally.
There was an attempt?
Yeah, Panavision ripped it off, but they lost. And the lawsuit and ended up as a license. So the patent remained uninfringed. Another couple of minor attempts were made and thumped down by my Swiss patent attorney. Even a Japanese one, well-funded, that eventually they capitulated with a comical English translation of "you right, we wrong, we no do this again" kind of thing. Because in that era, the document itself was almost like an illuminated manuscript, and the translation was a crude typewritten document that accompanied it. In any event, you just brought up something interesting to me, which is, I thought it was a stunt device, and it was in the demo we made for it, which became famous, that I realized that, hey, the stuff that I did walking looks fantastic. And walking and booming up and down and, having the freedom not only of pan and tilt, which all us operators had, and the freedom to move through space if you and a dolly grip or crane operator were in sync, but the fact that you had it all. You had, within that range of heights, you had pan and tilt and 3 axes of translation just within the length of the arm, and then you had everywhere your feet could go, and kneeling and sitting down on a box and being pushed, and as happened, climb up on a crane with it, or race across the ground on a camera car, and your knees and this arm take out all the bad stuff. Exhilarating is the word, and a combination of bravado and, I wouldn't say exhilaration cut in when you saw the dailies for these early features. My early forays were deeply frightening, because there you are with some alleged contraption that works on your pins with something that looks crude and weird to everybody else. There's no reference. So
there must have been quite a lot of apprehension from crews when they first saw you with this thing. Like, who's this kid? Kind of, what's he doing here? Like on Bound for Glory.
The minute they saw it when it came out of the box, yes. When they saw it in motion, there was the beginnings of an understanding that this might be all right. The kid has some kind of gadget. I once recall asking my wife, Ellen, who was as girlfriend in all those demos, running up and down, including down the Art Museum steps, which proved and eventually to be valuable. I remember asking her before Marathon Man, do you think the grips will be annoyed with this thing, in the sense that a lot of dolly track laying will go out the window if it becomes successful? And we couldn't answer that question. I didn't yet know that grips love, helping Steadicam operators, are our best friend on earth. And the reason we stay alive and can do half this stuff is the symbiosis between somebody guiding and keeping an eye out for you and, steering you through hazards and so on. And even catching you if you fall down in some notable instances, But then once we got at it in the feature world, the corresponding reward was what happened in dailies, which, you could almost not imagine a more comprehensive satisfaction. And the first one was Bound for Glory, that shot of Haskell's Wexler's coming down off a crane and walking 300 feet with Carradine and Randy Quaid, and coming back with them and penetrating the crowd like a ghost with nobody looking at the lens, and occupying apparently no space, because a human with this thing can slip through no gap at all. The lens can go between two close heads who then just breathe apart. And they all were looking at my face, not at the lens. And I had a lot of anxiety about the daily screening because Haskell's stuff was so brilliant, and he was so insouciant and, casual about the whole thing. Stick me up on a crane, everybody gathering around watching, followed through the crowd by an army of crew, Second take interrupted by an extra who came up to talk to David Carradine because this poor guy didn't recognize that me, who looked like I was carrying a sewing machine, was participating in this process.
He's used to a big crane following someone around, Yeah,
so that take, one of three, the first one was, aborted. The crane thing defeated me the first time. Then the extra interrupt, and in between each take, I only had one rear throat magazine, so they had to shut the production down, go into the trailer in the dark, and reload this complicated pattern. So those parties, the ADs and the assistants, were kind of annoyed because they were not used to somebody showing up with one magazine. That just seemed folly to them, But everybody piled into that screening room, as has been reported often. And I came in and went up to a guy and said, "Are you the projectionist?" hoping to get some kind of preview of what had happened. And he very coldly looked at me and said, "No, I'm the producer." So I slunk to the back of the room and made myself small and sat there watching all of Haskell's great stuff. And then this shot came up and just knocked them on their ass.
Wow.
And there was a silence, and then yelling, applauding, standing, yelling Haskell's name. I mean, everybody there, including me, had an inkling that things had changed. My life in particular. That was something. If you have more than one moment like that in a lifetime, or even one, you're lucky.
I was just thinking, if that had been shot and if that had been dramatized, the shot of you with everyone reacting around you would be done on a Steadicam, no doubt.
Yeah, wouldn't it? Yeah, and much else. It's actually more prevalent, more successful now, 48 years later, than ever. It's still growing. And a new Steadicam invention called the Volt. I don't know if you caught on to that one, but the Volt is a little accessory for the gimbal with a brilliant sensor. I allied myself with a great electronics guy named Steve Wagner and got him a license with Tiffin. And Tiffin backed this idea to the hilt and is selling thousands of this Volt thing, which just claps onto the gimbal of anybody's Steadicam pretty much and keeps it level. And level keeping was one of those housekeeping chores that was really annoying about Steadicam opera. You had to learn to do that. And it occupied some brain power while you're shooting. We got great at it and we did it well, but having that done for you it's as if you were playing a violin that would never stay in tune, and suddenly it automated and was in tune. And it's all done with two little motors and a sensor and a counter. It's clever as hell, and it weighs a couple of pounds. Doesn't affect the build, so-called, doesn't make your rig taller or shorter. And suddenly you're able to operate in neutral balance, which is the first time we've really practically been able to do that. And that's ideal because you can hurl it around and it doesn't change the angle of things. Because it's still a mechanical, exquisitely balanced, inert object. And now you can operate it with no bottom heaviness, so that's good.
But what was it about those directors back in 76? I mean, I had a short foray into the film industry when I worked for a company that supplied editing solutions. So I was installing Steenbecks and early Avids and early Lightworks. and I'd come from TV, and I was amazed at how antiquated the film industry was. That it stayed, pretty much the same. The processes stayed pretty much the same for, almost 100 years. And there's that traditionalism in the film industry that kind of stops progress. It's particularly in that period, I think, in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
So what was it about those directors, Hal Ashby and Avildsen, that they saw something in the Steadicam and they were bold enough to take it forward and put it in their movies?
I've puzzled over that. I imagined, of course, that since I owned this magic device, that I would work every day. And that was not the case. The phone did not ring for long periods of time because it was only the bold souls, those that had enough self-confidence, that went for it. But you're right, the business was quite conservative. It had come out of a studio system that was designed to almost maintain that status quo and control.
Yeah.
With a hammerlock on everybody and everything, including actors and actresses, under contract, to studios, those entities. And they were not particularly forward-thinking operations because they liked the way things worked. And they had, a lot of big, expensive old gear that, could go on craning forever, However, what escaped my notice when I was learning my trade in the library was that the whole business was edging out onto location. The Elemac, I believe, had just been invented. Little dollies that you could, Faoud Saeed had his film, what was it called? Filmmobile, Cinemobile. Faoud Saeed had Cinemobile, which was trucks that had a little crane platform on the roof, and it was a van, and it had enough gear for this new lightweight 16 millimeter Eclair camera, slightly faster film world to go out on location, and everything you needed was in this van. See, that was the idea. I lumbered myself with a heavier than normal dolly, 800 pounds. My crews were tormented by having to lift it onto pickup trucks to take on location with my 5 seconds of rusty ass rail, 4 straight and 1 curved. You can imagine those shots, and my camera pinheadedly on it, a Bolex with a, 24-second spring wind. So my version of the great Hollywood dolly shots was constrained and a bit odd, and it was so irritating, that dolly. And yet handheld, every time I tried it, was disappointing. I am something of a fetishist for, as it turns out, something that looks like we see. We have, as you hinted earlier, it's widely known now that we have a wonderful computer in our heads that stabilizes what we see. Startlingly stabilizes. It's processing on the order of what goes on in an iPhone and beyond. The iPhone is almost a cheating competitor to traditional cameras because it's all done with processing and wonderful stability tricks and overscans that they can make use of, and a processing speed that's so blindingly fast that they, even while you're shooting it, you almost can see it looks as it will. They've just released cinematic mode on the iPhone 13. Have you had a look at it?
I haven't. No, good. I've seen the demos, but I haven't seen it in person. Yeah,
that's forget bokeh and beautiful lenses and 50 mil true depth of field under the science of optics. They simply made it look great by using several little views and muddying it up and making it look, soft. And there you are in your hand is this wonderfully democratic instrument now, I could show you this actually, if you care to see it. Maybe we should use the video on this. I actually made the smallest Steadicam ever made, patented it, the whole works. Your eyebrows what's left of them just went up.
My eyebrows went up. Yeah, I don't have.
Just went up a little bit. So,
wow.
I wanted it to weigh the same as an iPhone, to be in your pocket, to be able to come out of your pocket and
Huh.
hold the camera, and you be able to operate it. Of course, it won't look very good without a camera, but you get the idea. It's weighted. It's a perfect counterweight. It weighs bloody nothing.
That's very cool.
So you may ask, where is this thing? Why did this not ever get made?
Yeah.
Because I lectured at Apple a few times to the group responsible for putting the stability into iPhones. And they didn't give away anything they were doing, but watching the progression, it was clear to me that, it's somewhat more of a pain to have to pull that thing of mine out of your pocket, open it up, put the camera on it, make a few balance tweaks before you can shoot, as compared to, you're there. Mm-hmm. And as that has proved out, the 13, you can walk pretty successfully with it, Mm. It's not as good as the camera on the little Volt Steadicam that we've made recently for phone cameras, but it's damn good, And so I think we made the right call not to spend a fortune tooling up for it and building it and trying to sell it for $150. No.
Yeah.
The discretion was way better than valor in that case.
People do get scared of these innovations and these changes in consumer end products as well, don't they? I know a bunch of Steadicam ops and they look at an Osmo Pocket, and I can see that they're, simultaneously kind of balking at it, but also going, shit, somebody could knock off some pretty steady shots pretty quickly, pretty cheaply. Was there ever a time during those early years of Steadicam where you had that same sort of protectionist kind of view where you thought, let's keep this amongst an elite group of us and keep it all in-house?
Yeah, it was early on. It was proposed. I had demoed the 16 millimeter demo to General Camera. Mm. And those guys loved the results. And they were the Panavision licensee, but they wanted to license this separately because they were annoyed with Panavision. And only have one. And it would work for $20,000 a week, and it would have black cloth on it and hide the detail. And I'm just so thrilled to this day that I had the wit to not go with that arrangement, because as I've told operators early on, when I would teach some of my early, some of the greats, Larry McConkey learned his trade in my townhouse, making dings on our doorways when he failed to glide through. And everybody said, "Oh God, don't teach anybody else. This is a great racket," And I understood that, for instance, if you were the only violin player in the world, you'd be in a circus, right? But if there are 100,000 violin players and you're good, that's where the long black limos and C-note per diems come in. In other words, it's the more there are out there, the more their energy broadens the market. And that has proved to be true. Every good shot made anywhere in Bangalore or Djibouti opens the eyes of that crowd, to an extent, and sends them in a direction that's useful for us, And so I'm wasn't then or now that worried about infringement, except that we heard that there was a Steadicam killer invention coming along, and very early on, and what turned out to be the Luma crane. And whoever was passing that bit of nonsense around thought that somehow would, get rid of Steadicam. And that wasn't not even the Technocrane, just the Luma, which Steven Spielberg had a lot of fun with on 1941. No, even now people say, is Steadicam doomed, because there are gimbals now, right, of all sizes, and so on. But they've been saying that for many years. And in fact, a two-man crew, gimbal and wheels operator. By gimbal, I'm referring to the motorized versions, the Ronins and so on. They're stupidly stable for sure, but they're appalling for operators. Even if you have a tight two-man crew and somebody's on the wheels and you just become a glorified grip, when you walk along, it's really hard to not reflect your steps holding it because you're fully loaded, your hands, therefore they're a very strong conduit of what you're doing. The combination of the arm, which is essentially frictionless within that sphere that you can reach, means that you can be doing this, as you saw in that original demo, and it does that.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability to move it gracefully through space as a fingertip operation is still not been, achieved by any of those things. So, and the fact that you can be something of an athlete with this thing, slipping through narrow spaces, having behind you, around you, you could be on any side of it you wish to be. You're not stuck behind it, with your arms getting tired, This sounds like a commercial for Steadicam, but what I'm really reciting the ways in which it is virtuous for moving the lens where you would ideally want it in French curves that would drive a dolly grip crazy, but are exactly what you want on screen,
Yeah, I was watching Rocky again yesterday. I watched Rocky again yesterday, and that scene through the meat locker where you're just backing through the beef hanging there, and
that's a great example.
Yeah, you don't really realize until you look at films that preceded that shot is spectacular because it reveals the set to us, or reveals the real location to us. It adds dimension to it. That's what the Steadicam does, doesn't it? It adds a 3D effect.
Yeah, sure. That's the most primitive reason that it's built, that I love it, that we love it. The 3D effect is what happens when you move through space. Your left and right eyes now, even one eye, and in 2D, if you're moving through space, you're giving the effect of the left and right eyes, and you are able to. Your brain tells you the dimensionality of things that doesn't exist in 2D if you're static. It that, and the fact that you can pretty much go anywhere, head, behind, pulling out of the way and back in ways that you can't even tell on screen. Even somebody just sitting down, the fact that you can drop at the same speed or allow them preferentially to drop a little faster than you and catch up a little, because that just looks better. If you drop at the same speed, it appears that the background rose behind them. But if you allow them a little bit of tilt in the process to stick with them, suddenly it's clear what you did, and yet you're not looking down at the top of their head.
Yeah,
there are aspects of art that we're still discovering, and I'm such a pussy. I'll sit there and just watch a movie and not even think about Steadicam, and Ellen will give me an elbow and go, "Wow, look at that!" And then I look and I go, "Wow, that's good. Who is that?" In the early days, we knew all the names. We started the Steadicam Operators Association in 1988. Nicola Pecorini and I, the great Italian operator, started it, and for a while knew, everybody. But that's long gone. Happily,
everybody still knows
gone.
you, Garrett. I know a bunch of Steadicam operators, and of course they all know you. One name, of course, which is big in your catalogue of movies as well, Stanley Kubrick. On The Shining, obviously one of the films that really made the Steadicam sing, I should say. How early on do you think Stanley?
Both actually.
Yeah. How early on do you think Stanley had in mind the use of the Steadicam for that film? Because it feels that that film couldn't have been achieved without it.
Well, you must have, or I would imagine you've seen reprinted the telex that he sent us. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, Stanley, that demo went what amounts to viral, but in 35 millimeter of all things, sent laboriously and mailed around the world, eventually was seen by all the hotshots. Stanley saw it right. He got it, one of the early copies in 35 millimeter. There were several dozen dubs made of it in 35. And Stanley sent back a thrilling telex that said, mystery stabilizer is spectacular. I can almost memorize it. You can count on me as a customer, blah, blah, blah. And he said, because he had a fine eye for stuff like this and loved to show off, he said, You may want to eliminate the 14 frames that show a shadow of it on the ground that reveal that there's something, slowly rotating and blah, blah, blah. Of course, we were horrified. We ran into the screening room, and yes, we cut them out. But Stanley immediately saw its utility, and we think, had the galleys for Stephen King's Shining, because he closed the telex asking, is there a minimum height at which it could be used? And he had a real dilemma, because to make a set the size of the Overlook, which flowed one to another through 6 or 8 stages, there is no way on earth to make floor good enough to roll anything across. Even a dolly, if you don't have, if you haven't laid down, milled planks or rails or something like that, you cannot roll a dolly down those corridors made of conventional construction. And the look of those shots that he got trying to put them on wheels must have been deeply dismaying, because the hotel's eye view of all eye views is sort of what those shots are, pinioned in the center and moving, like this. And if that's not smooth, I can imagine that was vexing. It was vexing enough to Stanley that he bought a deux chevaux, a 2CV Citroen they have amazing suspensions, stripped everything off of it, put a wooden platform in the back and a steering wheel so that the grips could push this thing, and hopefully the suspension would allow it to be stable. And the reports, and it was hanging around when I came to visit, the reports were that it just turned the period into a bigger, longer oscillation that was out of control. So I was, you might say, timely for that movie. And the result was those shots that are, eerily centered and have an effect, plunging through space, the 3D effect, but partaking of some of the other reasons why moving camera shots are so satisfying. The kinetics, just the pure joy of plunging through space. Of course, the 3D effect on the primitive side, but the emotional wallop, because moving is not simply, clicking a switch and you're going exactly 11.1 miles an hour, or whatever it is. Moving partakes of accelerations and decelerations, each one individual, doing this as I frighten people in workshops, that is an exclamation point. That is a emotionally stark and strong, whereas this has another character altogether, and on and on and on. The way you move, and not only forward and back, but vertically and sideways, and in curves and so on, and in combination with pans that come and go, and sometimes yield you looking to the rear and sometimes to the front, and then whip pans, which we devised years later. I could play with the camera and I'm sorry.
How difficult was it chasing Danny around on that trike then? Was that because he's going a fair old lick there, isn't he?
Yeah, he is, and as the great and late Winkle, our grip, pointed out, the kid's tireless, Stanley. I can't keep up. He's fucking tireless. Which he was. Apparently, you can ride one of those plastic big wheels for an eternity without fatigue. However, I took one look at that and realized that if I tried to run those things, and I knew by the time we got to that Stanley liked a lot of takes. So I'd been on the hunt for wheeled vehicles that I could ride on. Something that you'll recognize in the UK, but nobody in the US will know what it is. A sack barrel. Mm-hmm. Tried that. Terrible. Tried every form of dolly, but they can't be, pushed as fast or with a safety that would be required, trailing right after a kid. We ended up on the wheelchair that Stanley had Ron Ford build in which was just wheels, and it could be constructed in any direction, so he could sit on it handheld, so on. And I could hard mount to that thing and, kneel on it and get the lens 1 inch above the floor, which is a fabulous lens height. And there was, my Arri had no motor under it. The motor had been displaced to the side by a DeGiulio. So I literally could skim the floor with a matte box. And the only problem then devolved to poor Winkle and his teams of relay replacements that came in to run that around. And originally it had Dougie Milson, my assistant, on it, and a light, and that totally defeated the pushers. So we ended up without that. I started earlier to say that all this freedom of 360s and so on also transferred some of the issues to people like the DPs, that had to figure out a way to light like that. Names go flying in out of my head. The great late The Shining.
John.
Yes. John very cleverly had everything on dimmers, and he simply would dimmer up the stuff behind the actors and down the stuff behind me. And as I rolled around, he would simply swap that. So it was always, everybody was always somewhat backlit and looked great, And then he had those giant sidewalls with Marlocks and, up to 1,000 watt pars looking through Marlocks, which gave the impression of, that entire window full of very white out daylight, and that light had a great character as well.
So
and I could look straight at it. They put some stunted little pine trees at the bottom that barely exposed, and you believed it entirely,
Yeah.
So some of those issues also prevailed in the little apartment, because there was no way to have any lighting instruments in there at all. But watching my video assistant running the dimmers up and down just did a great job. And John would at times come up behind me with a solid flag and create a solid shadow behind, in place of my all too human shadow. And that felt fine on the set. It didn't feel like a problem. So those problems were pretty comprehensively solved during The Shining. It's great.
Yeah.
The peripherals, but the job is an auteur kind of job at best, and to have the grips and the DPs and the gaffers and so on involved in the process is great, just great. Becomes its own form of bravura filmmaking.
Yeah, I've seen you talk about how you really learnt your trade on The Shining because of being under the direction of Stanley Kubrick and his famous multiple takes. What was it, 147 takes for the Scatman Crothers and Danny scene?
148, yeah.
Was it 148?
48, and each one was 7 minutes long. And each take had 2 or 3 cameras running. So there were a lot of short ends involved with that because those 1,000-footers yielded a 300-foot short end, which was not, Stanley didn't want to use them. And I took many of them for experiments for another notion that I had that never turned into something. But I was obsessed with dreaming up a human-powered transportation thing. So I shot myself and others walking in 35 millimeter to analyze what you're really doing when you're walking. So I got all those short ends. It was fabulous. I wish I could have brought them home for our commercial activities. Yeah.
You've talked as well about the way the Steadicam turns, particularly in The Shining, and how it contributes to that kind of spooky serenity, I think you called it. Because you can kind of take a racing line, you've said as well, through a turn. Being a motor racing person myself, I know what that means, trying to make the straightest line between 2 points, essentially.
Yeah, it's the line that pulls the fewest G's, centrifugally.
Yeah.
But it's also what you as a runner would do. Another instance of, what an entity would do. What a dolly would do is have to get there and maintain some space on either side and then make a turn. What the Steadicam could do, particularly in the maze, was to cut past stuff,
Mm.
and that was really satisfying, immensely satisfying. Yeah. There was not any satisfaction other than that in shooting that maze scene indoors. It was hot.
Mm.
It was 100 degrees in there,
Wow.
and it was bright orange to the eye because those were uncorrected landscape lights
Mm.
in close proximity to super dried out pine needles, so that we were always afraid of fire
Mm.
in there, and styrofoam for snow. And of course, it would have been a toxic fire if it had ever gotten lit, and we would have been lost, totally lost, because we never knew where we were. They had to send in people with maps and hunt us down between takes, because you can't keep track in a featureless place like that of where the hell you are. The only distinctive place in it was the so-called central alley, and if you got in there, then you knew at least where you were, but not what direction anything was.
Crazy.
It was something. I had managed to acquire a illegal wireless video transmitter, which is where some of those Monty Python women imitations came from, because Stanley was very interested that it not escape the studio, the image. And I reassured him, because there was wire mesh on the studio wall, that would be a Faraday cage. It wouldn't get out, He knew enough to be dangerous about many subjects, but he recognized that expression. So he said, all right. And then he said, show me. Unfortunately, I had determined for myself the previous day that there were places where the image was perfectly visible outside the studio, but they came and went here and there. And I had made note of them anyway, so I was able to steer Stanley around outside the other places, not those places. But then Dougie and I went off, imitating the housewives who would watch us every morning, Ooh, it must be the 24 Distagon. Ooh, it's vignetting around the edges. Poor Mr. Bryan, look at those 24 takes. Oh, my. And Stanley hated that. We couldn't help ourselves.
I bet you had to kind of reprogram yourself to work for Stanley, though, just in terms of those multiple takes. You having worked on other films, you might get like you said with the Bound for Glory shot. You had 3 takes of that big shot.
Yeah.
And with Stanley having 50, 60, 100 maybe. How difficult, therefore, was it to get into that mode and then to get out of that mode once you went back to more conventional directors?
That's a good question. I never went beyond about 40. And I quickly realized that it was a pure gift for me, those takes, because they weren't difficult at all, because each take was separated by a 3-minute playback to my fortunate, thank God, video transmitter, and then a frequently 3-minute argument about where the crosshair should be, or what to do. And that was Stanley's time to reflect on what was happening. Seeing it back was part of the process. And the reasons that he did another one might have included that he hadn't figured out what to do next, or was waiting for an idea, or hoping that, something electric would happen in a take, which did happen at times. But for me, it was pure joy. I could have gone on doing it forever, literally. I mean, I was in great shape. I didn't care. And I realized that every take got better. The first 5, after 5, they were fine. Anybody else on earth would have said fine. At take 14, even Stanley, if pressed, would admit that there was no flaw in the take, because by then I was on rails. But then right on, on up into the 30s, I would realize for each take that, good Lord, if I stick this foot, just hold around the corner and put my foot here, I can actually get a little farther to the right here, or whatever, at some switch. And the classic was this shot following Wendy up 3 flights of steps, preceding her slowly, with her brandishing the knife and scared, coming up 3 flights of steps with music and so on. And they had a rig that was to rise up the middle of the staircase and rotate with her as she went around, but the results weren't all that great. But I was able to climb those stairs 35 times, 3 flights. It's the equivalent of climbing the Empire State Building in a day with the Steadicam. It was totally easy, because you go up 3 flights, then you have, 6 minutes of rest. I literally, I think, almost could have done it forever. And they did keep improving. And it was a staggeringly good shot, just in those terms. It swept close to and almost over those railings, and they gave you a reference, the railings slipping by your shot, which fed back to not, moving so that the railings would appear to move. I mean, that's a shot that I think about a lot, because a lot of that stuff had never been seen, would have been totally impossible.
Yeah. How amazing to have been gifted that chance to refine your craft to that extent that, would only exist maybe on the stage for an actor who's done a show 100 times or something.
Precisely. Yeah. And that's very insightful, Jamie, because that's what it felt like. I felt like I was a trooper on Broadway, and the 100th performance, I realized I can get even a little closer to the stage edge or whatever, I can be bolder here. And then by the time we got out into the maze and then back into that maze set, we were a very well-oiled machine, and I knew what I was doing pretty much by then. And I by then realized that the key to Steadicam was to teach people how to do it, as many as possible, and came out of there knowing just enough to teach people. So that was good.
Yeah. You talked I don't know if it was in Labruto's book, or you talked somewhere about the hospital scene in The Shining and how that was the best shot that you pulled off in that whole shoot. And of course, it's the scene that was then removed after the screening, the initial screening. What was it about that scene and that shot that seemed like perfection to you?
Well, first of all, Jenny, I'm very impressed with the homework you've done. You're not a slacker at this.
Thank you.
You've turned up some references that are pretty obscure. That's very good.
Good.
Of course, we've delayed doing this long enough that you had plenty of time.
If you'd have said yes straight away, I would have been screwed. But
no, I've learned never to do it.
I've followed your stuff for years,
I regret even doing it today, because if we waited another year, you'd even know more. Yes, the hospital scene was cut out of The Shining after the first screening in New York, which I attended. The critics pasted the film, and Stanley was very upset about it, reportedly very upset, and immediately cut that scene out of it. And I can't comment on whether that scene deserved to be in the movie or not. I remember it somewhat, but from the point of view of shooting it, Wendy is in a hospital bed, and Danny is there, and doctors are coming in and out, and there was some wrap-up dialogue and so on. But the work was spectacular. Some of the best stuff I've ever shot was in there, because I was at the top of my game, the Paganini of my instrument. And it was the farewell sequence. I literally departed for the plane the night after finishing that shot, said farewell to Vivian, and everybody hugs all around, even a awkward semi-embrace with Stanley, and adios. And seeing it in New York, I could appreciate the technical virtuosity of it, and was quite surprised that it ended up being cut out. And in fact, when I was given an honor of sorts by the Locarno Film Festival, for a treat, we arranged to try and find a print that had that sequence still in it. And Warner Brothers said they had one, and said they had shipped it to us. And unfortunately for all of us, I introduced it with the idea that this is a treat. This has never been seen since the New York screening. You're blah, blah, blah. and the film ran, and it wasn't there. And I think Vivian is very ardent at protecting Stanley's legacy, and it was his intent to lose it. So she was a voice for removing it. And I can't blame her. That the logic of it is intact. Stanley probably wouldn't have liked it being shown, but it was too bad that we didn't know that in time, because it was a little bit embarrassing to not have it there. So I have literally never seen it since.
Yeah, they are very protective. When I think about The Shining, I not only think about your fantastic work and Kubrick's fantastic vision, but also that behind the scenes documentary that Vivian shot. And I believe there are still maybe 20 to 30 hours of that just still sat in cans in the archive in South London here. It will never see the light of day, which is
no.
Which is
and there have been
shame.
a number of attempts, and some of them, I think Vivian isn't that interested that it be shown any more than what was in the film, which her dad approved of. And she's been, not exactly cherished by the rest of her family. And I won't go into any of that, except to say that, she's still out there defending Stanley ardently,
Yeah.
And I think the estate's interest is skewed slightly more commercial than that. But, they have a marvelous asset, and it's a completely unique body of work. And it's a total insanity and a vast shame that Stanley died at 70.
Yeah.
And he died of something entirely, that could have been identified and repaired.
Yeah.
So they were kind of asleep at the switch, I guess, and, taking care of him in that sense. And he wasn't taking care of himself. So
No.
that's a shock. I don't happen to believe that Eyes Wide Shut is anything like the movie he would have released 3 months later. It was a highest numbered Avid cut, I would have guessed, or some such, that they plucked up and released it with his scratch piano track on it. Who knows what it would have looked like or sounded like,
Yeah.
Well, that's too bad.
Maybe one day we'll find out. Maybe there'll be something buried somewhere, some notes somewhere about it. One of the other films I think about when I think about you and your Steadicam is Return of the Jedi, because those speeder bike shots, completely unconventional way to use the Steadicam in a way. That thinking outside the box was Dennis Muren, was it, that first approached you?
They asked if it could be done, and it turned out that I had done it. I had done it for a documentary a tourist documentary on Ireland, and had tested the idea on streets of Steadicam running at a super low speed and using its stability to, control the way the shot looked. And I had also made a documentary with a camera mounted in a motor home that drove 8,000 miles around the U.S. And for a climactic narration segment, 8 minutes long, in an ecology film, I delivered them, edited this 8-minute tour at 800 miles an hour down the roads of the U.S. And that one was stable by virtue of the fact that they were effectively long exposures for each frame. And so that predominantly you would be pointed in the same direction. So the impression was that there's a vast amount of blurring out to the side. For you, that would be like this. And the center more or less holds, and it was a really great looking thing. So I was able to show them that. And we decided that it would be worth testing. And I made my Arri run at 1 frame per second and walked through the redwoods. And they liked the results, so we went for it. And I was imagining that it was easy for them to make use of it. George informed me later at Haskell Wexler's birthday that it wasn't all that easy. They had to jump through a lot of hoops to get it to look as good as it did. But, there were only 3 possible plans, and this was one of them. And the other 2 were fiercely expensive. One was a 300-foot long model of a forest that the Dijksterflex would have sailed through. The other was to lay rails through the forest You're shaking your head already.
Yeah.
But
How
the
do you hide
plan
them?
was
Yeah.
well, you scatter leaves
Yeah.
over them,
Yeah.
and you reverse the shot so that you've swept the leaves away, but the
Mm.
reverse shot sees the
Mm.
leaf. It would have been immensely laborious and not nearly as flexible as what we did. And there's a little bit of vibration in that shot that feels sort of right. It feels like a vehicle is hurtling through there trying to shoot that. So we all ended up quite happy with it. And I started to hear rumors that this was a fantastic sequence, well before the film was released. So they did a wonderful job with the foregrounds matted in. So the lighting on those and the direction and so on was really great. So, Murin is a formidable character.
Yeah, I remember seeing that at the Dominion Theatre here in London on my birthday, and as a treat. And I remember going back to my grandparents that night, and that's the scene I spoke about again and again. I just couldn't believe that it was real, and it was real to me as a 7-year-old. Yeah.
And curiously, when they effectively redid it as the pod race in the first of the CGI ones, and let me say parenthetically by right now that in my whole career of about 100 films, I never shot a green screen scene in any one of them. And they were all film, not digital. I had retired by the time digital penetrated to that extent. So everything I shot was real. It was models or, it was stuff, real stuff. The pod race wasn't nearly as gripping as the speeder bike chase. And yet it was much faster, much more hairy and full of stunts and, alarms and crashes and impossible shit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was effectively a cartoon compared to the speeder bike chase.
Yeah.
Speeder bike chase was sort of grounded in a just barely reality somehow.
Yeah,
agreed. And the pod race had launched beyond. And you might say the same thing about the rope bridge scene, in Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Because we shot it on a real rope bridge at 100 degrees, Fahrenheit and 100% humidity, built by a mining or a dam building company up the river, concealed their steel wire ropes underneath fake rope, and bounding around like an impossible object, just totally out of control. But it was 380 feet above the river. The CGI boys would have made it 1,000 feet, and they would have made the boards even farther apart. Why not? And therefore, it suddenly approaches a cartoon.
You don't buy it.
If it gets no.
Yeah, I just watched again in my research, and I've seen it before, that little snippet of you and Stephen on the bridge there, Harrison just pelting it across in one go because he has balls of steel, or he's a maniac, who knows. And you and Stephen talking about how he thought that you and he were very wise because you wouldn't go out any further than kind of 40 yards because you had an understandable fear.
No, it's totally wrong. He's projecting his own feelings.
Right,
I was everywhere on that bridge and running, and Stephen was very reluctant to go out on it, didn't like it. And we had all said, well, is it safe? Because there are these slender boards with about this much room in between each one. You couldn't walk sideways, your feet would go down. You had to walk toe and heel straight ahead, even if you're turning, like a ballet dancer. You had to plie your ass back the other way. And Stephen said, yes, these are flame-hardened boards. And in fact, the board did break under Harrison, who was quite annoyed by it. And his leg went down to the crotch in the thing. And no other board broke, fortunately. And we were all shut down while the heaviest grips jumped on every board and found a couple more that broke and replaced them with even more flame-hardened boards. And then we went back to running on it, and I have to hand it to Harrison. He went back and just did it, and I did it right behind him, except I weighed 60 pounds more than he did with the Steadicam. So I wasn't quite as overjoyed by the whole thing after that incident. I was underjoyed.
You must have been asked to do shots that in the early years you thought, yeah, I'm going to do this because it's going to help with the progression and the sale and the evolution of it. But
yeah,
when did the point come where you thought maybe I shouldn't be saying yes to everything?
No, I got in trouble with that attitude because I both was the operator, but also the involved in its success, and so I wanted it to succeed, and I did not want to say no, that's not good, it's not safe. And I've done things and had falls and accidents, more than one that might have been fatal, just from that degree of bravado, which was very unwise. I've gotten myself into trouble and I managed to survive a couple of things that were really just dumb, out of that exact desire to promote the thing, I mean, running in places that weren't scouted, or agreeing to become a crash box because I could sit on an apple box and let a stunt car come hurtling toward me and then leap out of the way, and we didn't have a crash box. And that car didn't go right and did not flip and came bounding along. And I had the newly designed quick release on. And the stunt guy who was helping me released me and hauled me out of there, and the car squashed my rig in a TV movie, So I should have been chastened by that, but I have fallen running, yes, somewhat hazardous, particularly if you're careless, I had knee pads on and fell so hard on one movie that I hurt my knee. I've agreed to do stupid stuff.
You're clearly somebody who has an amazing technical ability as well as an artistic vision and understanding of the science, the art, and all of that stuff that's involved in inventing something like the Steadicam. And also, you've got your dive cam, and you have your Mobi cam and Skycam and all those things. What is it that drives you? Have you ever done any analysis on what is it that drives you to come up with these inventions? Because are you engaging the emotional level of what the shot can give now?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you said initially with the Steadicam you didn't, but yeah.
I love the shots. I love the way they look. What I love about Skycam is the shots. The shots are fantastic. And some of those shots didn't get, some of them we did early on, right away, and demos just went right for it. And early games have some great shots. But since then, there are wonderful crews on Skycam, and that's a two-man phenomenon. Somebody moves it around up and down, and somebody pans and tilts. And if they're joined at the hip, intellectually and artistically, boy, the results can be great because they're shooting something that is not planned, and so it's their agility, mental and physical agility, that keeps it with them. Amazing, absolutely amazing stuff. And I think it's the shots. I just love the shots. I love them so much that I get into them and don't even think about how they're done anymore, as I said. But
yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, I mean, having worked on motorsport for years, and I've been on the Olympics and World Athletics and things, so I've seen many of these inventions, and I think sometimes there's a kind of disconnect between what the shot can offer and what it's doing, what it's doing emotionally. And I saw you
sometimes, may I interrupt and say that sometimes that's an editorial matter in television, because we shot, for example, a thing called Live Aid, if you'll recall that concert. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We shot the U.S. edition, which was in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And we made some heart-stoppingly beautiful shots. And they were so coked up in the control room that they cut them into 16-frame hunks.
Yeah.
So when we saw the broadcast, we were bitterly disappointed that nobody had the good sense to let a shot develop, and they were shots designed to develop and amaze and, carry you forward. And they just couldn't resist cutting, cut. So Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Before we close, I just wanted to say to you that during my research, a friend of mine who works at the BBC, who's been very good to me in my little podcast here, because it is just me doing this, he has interviewed everybody. And I said, have you ever interviewed Garrett Brown? He said, I have. He said it was 1995. I went out to Philadelphia and I interviewed him out there. And there were two things. He sent me the transcript. There were two things that jumped out at me. You said in 1995, and I quote, "And I used to joke back then, which has got to be 10 years ago, so 1985, that I would end up as the last of the real-time cowboys. Basically, I would end up my days on a blue screen set, which is the way you do these optical things, just shooting faces with naked actors where all the wardrobe sets and props would be put in by ones and zeros." You've essentially come up with what's happening now, all those years ago, for those Marvel movies.
What prompted that remark was seeing a film called The Last Starfighter.
Yeah.
The Last Starfighter was the first one that it was all CGI. It wasn't, the models and the Dykstra flex.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And real lighting was all ones and zeros. And looking at that, I thought, damn, we're going to watch this happen when avatars get good enough to fool you. Cameron gets away with his avatars because they're so different physically that you can't nail them down. But nobody has quite yet made a fake human that will fool you either with the Turing test over, by audio means or by appearance. But they will. And that will be a shocking and scary thing, because they'll be much cheaper than actors. And if one of them becomes famous, and has fans, stand back.
Yeah. There's one other thing you said in this same interview. You're clearly a man with an eye in the future, because you talked about a disembodied camera, and then you joked about how you would patent it and sell it to fast food companies so they can deliver junk food.
And there it is, drones.
It's happened.
Jesus Christ!
Incredible.
I mean, I even joke about the Skycam, which is, one could say, why aren't they drones? Out there, they will be the size of bumblebees. They'll be high def 8K cameras, stable as a church, the size of a bumblebee. There'll be one for each player. And I joke that when that happens, why would you want a Skycam, except that they'll have to issue the players badminton rackets to, keep the drones away from themselves while they play.
Yeah, I was recently working on the Formula One Qatar Grand Prix, and they had a drone light display which was drawing faces and doing a countdown from 10, and you kind of look at it, but you can't really take it in. It's just kind of mind-boggling. You can't quite perceive what it, because you can't see the kit. You just kind of, I don't know, you kind of shrug at it.
Yeah, it's shocking. Yeah, I saw a demo of that live and I couldn't believe it. Well, buckle up. We're in for a really wild ride. I don't know if you have any time left, but I'm listening with great joy to a series of books written by a woman who wrote as Ellis Peters called Brother Cadfael. And that ended up on TV with Derek Jacobi playing the character. But the books are a marvel. And what's marvelous to me is just comparing life in 1140 AD, beautifully brought to life by her, with this insane existence that we have now. Insane on so many ways, interhuman relationships, polarized by media that pander to this faction or that faction, and behaviors that are noticeably medieval in some respects. So I don't know.
Yeah,
stand by.
You're absolutely right. Well, Garrett, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad we finally managed to do this, and I really appreciate you giving your time and telling us your stories and your, imparting your expertise and everything else. It's wonderful.
Thanks, Jan. I enjoyed it. Good luck to you. All right. Take care. Bye.
Cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Garrett Brown, inventor of the Steadicam, and so much more, as you heard. Look-alike and sound-alike of Jim Cameron, by the way. Well, in my opinion anyway. I've put the link to the original Steadicam demo reel on the show notes. Well worth checking this out if you've not already seen it. Okay, for the next episode, I have visual effects guru Craig Barron. We had a chat a couple of weeks ago. Craig started his career at ILM and went on to create Matt Weld, and now works at Magnopus. Really interesting guy with a fascinating career. So many films that he's worked on. In fact, we're thinking of doing a part 2 at some point. Yeah, fingers crossed we can do that because there's so much more to talk to him about. I've also just lined up 2 more interviews, one with VFX supervisor Paul Franklin. I'm actually going down to Double Negative, DNEG, in London to interview Paul. Really looking forward to that. Actually get out and see some people. It'd be nice. And while in London, I'm also visiting the Regent Street Cinema to interview the folks that run it. It's had quite the history, actually. A really interesting little story, hopefully, to come out of that one. I've also got a rather exciting project about to begin shooting. My cameraman pal, Paddy, and I are travelling to the US to interview someone. I'll tell you more when things are up and running. It isn't being funded by the podcast. It's going to be completely separate. I hope to go down the crowdfunding route for this project, but we're really keen to get this core interview on tape as soon as we can, because I feel once people see what we've got, then they'll be maybe more willing to help us get it finished. In the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries Podcast.